Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is James Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 15 tight end and quarterback rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're talking about all things related to the tight end and quarterback positions, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing tight ends in a half PPR scoring format and quarterbacks in a 4-point per passing touchdown format on a weekly basis between weeks 8 through 14 in order to give ourselves more of an understanding and more of an insight as to who has the most advantageous matchups going into Week 15, the first round of our fantasy playoffs, in order to give ourselves more perspective as to who potentially is going to meet their overall upside. After we talk about matchups, we'll then transition to the top 16 rankings of each position, as I'll share with you guys my perspective and opinions and the stats that justify my reasoning as to how I think it's going to all stack up when it's all said and done at the end of Week 15. And many of us are advancing to the next round of our playoffs. And that's the entire goal of this channel. Help you advance to the next round, help you capture a 2021 fantasy football championship. So if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe. Help us get to that 58,000 subscriber mark, another accomplishment that I cannot thank you guys enough for helping us get there. Again, if in fact you haven't yet already and you consider subscribing, please do so, because we're going to go all the way to Week 18 for those of you who unfortunately may be playing in a Week 18 championship, and even beyond that, going into the NFL playoffs. So we'll be able to play some NFL playoff leagues. For those of you who haven't been able to do so in years past, I absolutely suggest that you take the advantage of doing so this season. Of course, you can go ahead and do so via Underdog Fantasy, draft a couple best ball teams, draft teams for the daily contest throughout the NFL playoffs, and even tonight for the Thursday night football game between the Los Angeles Chargers, Kansas City Chiefs. If you go down to the link in the description and use promo code Andrew when you sign up today, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. Again, there's another way to play fantasy football on a weekly basis. Despite the teams that you may have, you can go ahead and have more fantasy football in your life. Why not? Maybe even if you don't want to play fantasy football, there's fantasy basketball, there's the NHL, and if you don't want to draft teams, there's the pick'ems. You can go ahead, pick over, under on a given statistic, and 5 times your money in one night. For those of you interested, check that out. Link is down in the description. Again, use promo code Andrew today. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about our Week 15 tight end position. That's where we're going to begin for today's episode, talking about matchups. As you can see on screen, from weeks 8 through 14, this is how it is pretty much stacked up, with the Philadelphia Eagles, Seattle Seahawks, Cincinnati Bengals, Cleveland Browns, and Las Vegas Raiders giving up the most points to opposing tight ends. And there's a pretty big division because those teams are giving up a bunch of touchdowns to opposing tight ends. That's 5 touchdowns in many of these cases out of the last 6 weeks for these teams. And as long as they're giving up this kind of volume of touchdown opportunity to opposing tight ends, then by all means, we want to take advantage of those matchups. So Ricky Seals-Jones may be more of an enticing play. Of course, Tyler Higbee should be a great play this week. The Cincinnati Bengals, of course, they'll have their hands full with 2 tight ends in the names of Noah Fant and Albert Okwuegbunam. Of course, the Cleveland Browns, Foster Moreau will most likely be the tight end because Darren Waller was deemed out earlier today. Another tight end, in fact, besides Darren Waller deemed out, is TJ Hawkinson. Many of us will be struggling, so hopefully today's video will help you find that tight end that is going to serve for you not only this week, but in weeks to go, and of course help you win a 2021 fantasy football championship. But outside of some of the easier matchups at the position, the tougher ones that we typically want to avoid, the Patriots, the 49ers, the Washington football team, Denver Broncos, those are teams that have been absolutely fantastic against opposing tight ends thus far this season as of late, and we typically don't want to mess with those unless we have a stud tight end in a given matchup, perhaps like Dallas Goedert taking on the Washington football team. Either way, just wanted to give you guys context. We'll refer back to these statistics as we talk about the tight end position, but let's go ahead and get into that immediately. Talking about the tight end position for Week 15. Do not forget, like I always mention and put it up on screen, rankings are subject to change. This is not the end all be all. We will be live streaming on Saturday and Sunday in order to give you guys more perspective as to how I think we should adjust the rankings and potentially play our team. Sunday morning, we always do that 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. But specifically in the next couple weeks, the NFL will be having games on Saturday. So I will be streaming Saturday afternoons. Exactly what time, I'll kind of update you tomorrow when we post our hidden gems. But in terms of what to expect, it'll be a couple hour live stream as I'll be answering questions, trying to help you guys out for those Saturday games. Outside of that, let's get into it, shall we? Beginning with our number 1, it is George Kittle. George Kittle, as of late, has been an unstoppable force. Since coming back from his injury, he has scored 6 touchdowns in 6 games. In fact, 6 touchdowns is his career high in a single season, and he's done that in the last 6 games already. He's coming off of back-to-back weeks of over 100 receiving yards. In fact, his total for the last 2 weeks is 332 total receiving yards. I've gone ahead and I've gone back in the last 5 years in the NFL, and the only other tight end that has pretty much been able to compete with that number is Travis Kelce with 295 receiving yards in a 2-week span. The fact that George Kittle was able to blow out that number by this margin just kind of speaks to the amount of volume he's getting in terms of opportunity and how well he has been playing despite the matchups that he is facing on a weekly basis. George Kittle is absolutely fantastic, coming off of another 25-point game. He currently is in the conversation of being an MVP for many of our teams, and hopefully will continue to be the same. Moving on to Travis Kelce. Now, I wanted to go ahead and take inventory of the idea of when the last time I had Travis Kelce as my number 2 tight end, because this season already, unless he was on a bye, I have had Travis Kelce as my number 1 every single week. And obviously for good reason. The guy's been the number 1 overall tight end in fantasy for the last 5 consecutive years. So why not go ahead and put our faith in a guy that's been so consistent? But unfortunately, he hasn't been consistent as of late, and George Kittle has purely just been outplaying him. Nonetheless, the last time we had Travis Kelce as the number 2 ranked tight end on a given week was week 5 of the 2020 season. I went back to that video and I found it. He was behind George Kittle, so very similar. But either way, I think Travis Kelce is going to be perfectly fine this week. You're absolutely starting him, and he's got a great matchup, the 10th easiest at the position. Specifically against the Los Angeles Chargers, he has found a lot of success in 3 out of the last 4 games. 7 catches, 104. 9 catches, 90 and a touchdown. 7 catches, 92 and a touchdown. Of course, these are great 10-plus fantasy point performances, and I think he's very easily going to be able to meet that standard tonight against the Los Angeles Chargers on Thursday Night Football. Moving on to Mark Andrews, our number 3. I don't expect Lamar Jackson to play, and as you'll see later in this video, I don't even have him ranked because I think that ankle injury may hold him out for a week, considering the fact that they're playing against the Green Bay Packers, and it may be a scenario in which they may not even be able to win. They may have to hold him out this week. Now, where does that kind of potentially leave Mark Andrews? Many of you may think that they may downgrade Mark Andrews, but in my opinion, it kind of leaves him in a very similar spot, if not in a better scenario, because in the last 2 games that Mark Andrews has played with Tyler Huntley as the quarterback of the Baltimore Ravens, he has gotten himself incredible opportunity and delivered on every possible target that has been sent in his direction. Specifically, this last week when Tyler Huntley came into the game against the Cleveland Browns, the connection between Mark Andrews and Huntley went 9 targets, 9 catches, 111 yards, and a receiving touchdown. And the time prior against the Chicago Bears, in which Huntley started, the total opportunities, 10 targets, led to 8 receptions, 73 yards. There's a lot of work to be had here, and I think as long as Mark Andrews and Huntley continue to be, prime connection in this offense, I think Mark Andrews is a safe play against the Green Bay Packers this week. Moving on to Rob Gronkowski, our number 4. Now, I love Gronk. I mean, he's been incredible. Since week 11, he's the number 3 overall tight end in fantasy, putting up 13.6 fantasy points per game on average. The only issue is, unfortunately, he plays against the New Orleans Saints, and the Saints, for some reason, have his number. In the last 4 games that Rob Gronkowski has participated against the New Orleans Saints, his total overall contributions have been 2 catches for 11 yards, 1 catch for 2 yards, 0 catches, and then 1 catch for 14 yards. His best performance is literally 2 catches for 11 yards against the Saints going back to 2020. That, in my opinion, is very concerning, which makes me kind of lean in the direction of probably still having him start because he's getting such great opportunity as of late. And I think that opportunity will defy the matchup that he faces. But we have to be careful because the Saints certainly know how to play against Gronk. Moving on to Dawson Knox, number 15, another one of these tight ends that has been incredible as of late. Since week 11, has been the number 4 overall tight end in fantasy, just behind Gronk, averaging 11.4 fantasy points per game. The fact that he has the opportunity of taking on the Carolina Panthers, who honestly got torched by the tight end position last week. Of course, the Atlanta Falcons had 7 catches, 76 yards, and a touchdown from their 3 contributing tight ends. That's 17.1 total fantasy points. And the fact that Dawson Knox is coming off of a game in which he had 9 targets, 7 catches, 60 yards, and a touchdown, 15.5 fantasy points against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers continues to build confidence in my eyes. Of course, while the defense is going to be trying to bottle up Josh Allen from running all over the place, bottle up Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley, Gabriel Davis, Dawson Knox continues to dominate the middle of the field, and I think he'll continue to do so once again this week. Moving on to Pat Freiermuth, again, another one of these stud tight ends. Since week 6 of the NFL season, of course, he's been averaging 11.12 fantasy points per game with Big Ben under center. Again, last week could have had himself a second touchdown on the final play of the game, but unfortunately, Harrison Smith popped it out, and a 10-point fantasy performance could have been 17, but nonetheless, we will take it. This guy continues to score touchdowns. He continues to be a viable prospect. And yes, taking on the Tennessee Titans defense may not be the easiest overall matchup, but we're not concerned about it. Pat Freiermuth has been far too consistent since week 6 to go ahead and ignore his overall opportunity in this respective offense. We're, of course, firing him up once again. Moving on to Mike Gesicki. With the information that Jalen Waddle is most likely going to be out this week, along with Myles Gaskin, Salvin Ahmed, there is going to be a complete transition for the Miami Dolphins offense, just throwing the ball the entirety of this game to Mike Gesicki and a player like Devontae Parker. I mean, with Mike Gesicki getting more and more opportunity, I think that's going to obviously transition to him being a great overall fantasy play in comparison to where he's been in the last couple weeks, where it's been like 6 to 8 points. But the last time we saw him prior to the bye week, 11 targets, 7 catches, 46 yards. If we can see a very similar number in terms of total targets against the New York Jets, then by all means, he can have himself a great week. I mean, the last time the Miami Dolphins took on the New York Jets, the tight end position for the Miami Dolphins had 10 catches for 106 yards. Of course, most recently, Brevin Jordan, 3 catches, 23 and a touchdown against that defense. Dallas Goedert, 6 catches, 105 and 2 touchdowns against the New York Jets. A lot of potential to be had there. Moving on to Zach Ertz, the final of our top 8. Zach Ertz playing against the Detroit Lions. Of course, Detroit cannot stop the tight end position. So let's go ahead and let's mention some of the recent performances. Denver, last week, Okwuegbunam and Fant combined for 9 catches, 92 yards, and a touchdown. Chicago, between, of course, Cole Kmet and Jimmy Graham, combined 10 catches, 99 and a touchdown. The Cleveland Browns, 6 catches for 73. And the Philadelphia Eagles, 7 catches for 81 yards. The Detroit Lions cannot stop opposing tight ends. And of course, Zach Ertz, with DeAndre Hopkins out, continues to get more opportunity on a weekly basis, which will, of course, lead to him dominating the middle of the field like many of these tight ends do. I think Zach Ertz absolutely a must-start play this week as our number 8. Moving on to our second half of the tight end conversation, beginning with Dalton Schultz. Now, I know many of you are disappointed with the fact that Dalton Schultz literally only had 1 catch for 4 yards against the Washington football team, but they have been pretty good against the opposing tight end position as of late. With that being said, I'll tell you who hasn't been great. The New York Giants. Most recently, of course, Jared Cook scored a touchdown on them. Darren Waller, 7 catches, 92. Gronk, 6 catches, 71. Gesicki, 7 catches for 46. A lot of these teams continue to send the ball in the direction of their tight ends because they know they could take advantage of the New York Giants linebackers and safeties. And I think that's certainly going to be the case this week for Dalton Schultz in this offense. I mean, the last time he took on the New York Giants defense, had himself 6 catches for 79 yards, continued to have his breakout performances back then in the season, and hopefully will get back to being more consistent and less of an invalid play like he was this last week. Moving on to Dallas Goedert, our number 10. Again, like I mentioned, the Washington football team matchup is very difficult. They're giving up the 3rd fewest points to opposing tight ends on a weekly basis since week 8. And that kind of does concern me to an extent, especially considering Dalton Schultz only had 0.9 fantasy points last week. But I'm going to go ahead and give Dallas Goedert the benefit of the doubt. I think he has the talent and the opportunity to be able to overcome such a matchup against the Washington football team. Because again, in terms of being an overall, kind of receiver in this offense, in my opinion, he's the number 1. Yes, Devonta Smith has had himself big games, but isn't consistent enough, in my opinion, to validate him as the number 1 receiving option. I think that is Dallas Goedert, and I think in a matchup in which they have to win, as they're fighting for a playoff spot against a division rival, who Dallas Goedert has found a lot of success in going back to last season, there's a very good opportunity for him coming up ahead. Moving on to Kyle Pitts. Again, Kyle Pitts has been, very inconsistent, hasn't scored touchdowns, though he had himself 5 catches for 61 last week. Again, it is very difficult to play him against a defense like the 49ers, who have given up the 2nd fewest amount of points to the opposing tight end position in the last 7 weeks. Kyle Pitts, as we all know, is an extremely talented tight end, but unfortunately, we cannot get him into the top 10 conversation. We just have to go ahead and hope that the yards and the receptions will be enough to suffice this week. Moving on to Tyler Higbee. Tyler Higbee should be able to score a touchdown because as of late, tight ends have scored in bunches against the Seattle Seahawks. There's a reason why they have given up the 2nd most points to opposing tight ends. But if Tyler Higbee doesn't score, by all means, hopefully the receiving yards is going to get the job done. I think very easily Tyler Higbee could be a top 8 tight end this week. Just a matter of what we end up seeing from the health of the Los Angeles Rams, from OBJ, Darrell Henderson. But specifically, let's talk about some recent performances. Brevin Jordan, 4 catches, 26 and a touchdown. You may be thinking, okay, 10 fantasy points, not a big deal, Andrew, but that just is only where it begins. George Kittle, 9 catches, 181, 2 touchdowns. Zach Ertz, 8 catches, 88 and 2 touchdowns. That's 3 out of the last 4 games for the Seattle Seahawks. They cannot stop opposing tight ends, and I think Tyler Higbee certainly has himself a great chance this week of being a top 12 tight end. Moving on to Noah Fant, our number 13. Again, if Albert Okwuegbunam is going to steal value on a weekly basis, then by all means, we're in a little bit of trouble. But Either way, the Cincinnati Bengals, they've given up the third most points to opposing tight ends as of late. It wasn't even just George Kittle's singular performance. It's been the last 5 weeks as they've given up a touchdown to an opposing tight end in the last 5 weeks consecutively. So George Kittle, 13 catches, 151 and a touchdown, great. Freiermuth the week before, 4 catches, 40 and a touchdown. The Vegas Raiders combined for 8 catches, 135 and a touchdown. Cleveland Browns, 5 catches, 58 and a touchdown. Tyler Kroft, 2 catches, 20 yards and a touchdown. There have been great performances week in and week out against the Cincinnati Bengals defense. And by all means, Noah Fant should be able to step up this week and have himself a great one as well. Moving on to Tyler Conklin. Now, I understand he had himself only 3 points this last week, but he takes on the Chicago Bears, giving up the 11th most points to opposing tight ends as of late. As long as Adam Thielen is going to be out once again this week, which I expect to be the case considering he did not practice again today, there's probably another opportunity for a tight end to step up against this defense. I mean, most recently, DeGuara and Mercedes Lewis for the Green Bay Packers, 7 catches, 95. Hawkinson the week prior, 35 and a touchdown. Andrews, 8 catches for 73. Freiermuth, 43 and 2 touchdowns. There's a lot of opportunity here. I know the Chicago Bears defense is a tougher one, but Tyler Conklin does still have great opportunity without Thielen in the lineup. Moving on to Hunter Henry. Hunter Henry should be able to play. He takes on the Indianapolis Colts. The Colts cannot stop opposing tight ends. I mean, yes, I know Hunter Henry hasn't scored a touchdown since week 10 of the NFL season, and that has kind of given us a 3-week gap here in which we haven't used his services. But at least as of late, Indianapolis truly can't stop tight ends. Gronk, 7 catches, 123. Knox, 6 catches, 80. Arnold, 5 catches, 67. And the New York Jets combined for 8 catches, 82, and a touchdown against that defense. You know, there's a lot of opportunity to be had here. We'll just have to wait and see if Hunter Henry can deliver on it. Moving on to our final option, Gerald Everett. Gerald Everett, since week 10, since the return of Russell Wilson to this lineup, has been the number 9 overall tight end in fantasy, and that's also including the negative point performance he put up 2 weeks ago. Gerald Everett is very easily, in my opinion, a top 7 tight end in the last 4 or 5 weeks in terms of overall contribution and overall opportunity, might I add. As long as this team continues to go in his direction with DK Metcalf struggling and the fact that, of course, this Los Angeles Rams team is going to want to shut down DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, I think Gerald Everett continues to be in a pretty good position for a revenge game against this former team. All right, now that we've talked about the tight end position, let's go ahead and transition to the quarterback position, talking about weeks 8 through 14 in terms of matchups. As we can see on screen, these are the teams giving up the most points to opposing quarterbacks: the New Orleans Saints, Minnesota Vikings, Chicago Bears, New York Jets, Las Vegas Raiders. While on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Patriots, Carolina Panthers, Buffalo Bills, Chiefs, and Browns. Overall, we're basically looking at passing yards, passing touchdowns, rushing yards, rushing touchdowns, because we all know the ability to get some extra points on the ground, even with a relatively immobile quarterback like perhaps a Joe Burrow or perhaps a Russell Wilson, who though they don't like to run the ball very often, the ability to do so is in their repertoire. So if we're in a scenario in which the respective defense cannot contain the quarterback and they have the opportunity to run even more, get a rushing touchdown out of it, then by all means, we're looking into something like that as being a potential upside for our respective quarterbacks. But either way, I will refer back to these statistics as we progress. Obviously, the Patriots have been unstoppable against opposing quarterbacks. I don't think, Carson Wentz is only putting up 7 points this week, but you never know. Either way, just wanted to go ahead and throw these out to you guys, give you guys some perspective. We'll refer back to these. But let's go ahead and let's transition to our top 16 quarterback rankings on the week, beginning with Kyler Murray. Now, look, I understand Kyler Murray this last week was a little bit underwhelming in comparison to how I hyped him up. But even with his perhaps worst game of the season, I mean, the fact that he had his lowest passing completion percentage and he had 0 passing touchdowns, I mean, it's at the level in which he played against the Green Bay Packers. But despite having such a bad performance, the fact that he still put up 19.42 fantasy points, had 383 passing yards, and had his second consecutive week of over 50 rushing yards, and set his season high in terms of rushing yards, 61 on 7 total rushing attempts, leads me to believe that there's a lot of potential for him this week against Detroit. Now, I understand DeAndre Hopkins is out, but I don't think that's the end-all be-all. That's just another target, another tool that they could use on a weekly basis. They'll have to opt away from it. If, in fact, we're in a scenario in which, of course, James Conner misses this week, then that's going to mean Kyler Murray's running the ball, he's throwing the ball, and he's leading this team through his arm and just completely taking over the game, because he'll need to do so in order to win and continue to maintain the top seed in the NFC. Moving on, we have Tom Brady as our number 2. Tom Brady's been incredible, and the fact that he takes on the easiest matchup of the quarterback position, by all means, it's just going to be a cakewalk. He was able to throw for 363 yards 2 touchdowns last week against the Buffalo Bills. Fantastic secondary. Had himself a rushing touchdown, even 16 rushing yards. I mean, Tom Brady was everywhere on the field. Either way, he takes on the New Orleans Saints earlier this season in Week 8. He did take on the same matchup and had himself a lot of success. Though he threw a couple interceptions and they did lose that game, was still able to get 375 passing yards and 4 passing touchdowns for 25.2 fantasy points. I think in a great matchup, in a perfect position, Tom Brady should be able to succeed once again this week as our number 2. Moving on to our number 3, Josh Allen. Now, there's been a conversation as to whether or not he's dealing with an injury. I know he ran for 109 yards last week, a rushing touchdown, 36.22 fantasy points, was the number 1 quarterback on the week. But even though people think he has a turf toe, there's been rumors and people have seen him out in public. He's not wearing a walking boot, nothing to that extent. So even if he does have an injury, it's not going to get worse by him walking on it. He'll be fine. He's going to participate, and he's obviously going to dominate like he has done this season already. In 10 of his 13 games thus far this season, he has had 2 or more touchdowns. As long as he continues to build on the fact that he's running the ball more, I think Josh Allen is just going to be undeniable as potentially finishing at the top of the quarterback position in terms of total fantasy points. Moving on to Aaron Rodgers, again, talking about just dominating on a weekly basis. In the last 3 games, he has had 11 total offensive touchdowns. I mean, the fact that he has been dealing with a toe injury and has been able to put up such great consecutive performances, has the privilege of taking on the Baltimore Ravens, the 9th easiest matchup at the quarterback position. The fact that that secondary and defense has been missing a lot of their stud players, it just leads me to believe that, of course, yes, they're going to be able to dominate. The fact that the Baltimore Ravens are the 2nd best run-stop defense in terms of giving up fantasy points to opposing running backs as of late leads me to believe that there's a possibility they run the ball less with Aaron Jones still dealing with a knee injury. This is going to be a pass-heavy scheme and approach from Aaron Rodgers this week against Baltimore. Moving on to Justin Herbert tonight against the Kansas City Chiefs. The last time he took on the Chiefs, Week 3, 281 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 30.84 fantasy points. If we see anything remotely close to that performance, then by all means, we're in a fantastic position. In fact, since that performance, since Week 3 of the 2021 season, he's been the number 2 overall quarterback in fantasy. He has had 9 out of the last 11 games of 2 or more touchdowns. And as of late, he's been on a 4-game streak of 2 or more touchdowns in this offense, coming off of a game in which he blew out the New York Giants, 275 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and barely played in the 4th quarter. I think Justin Herbert, the sky's the limit, continues to dominate on a weekly basis. Moving on to Patrick Mahomes, the opposite end of this matchup. The Kansas City Chiefs will be traveling to Los Angeles today to take on their division rival in the Los Angeles Chargers. Patrick Mahomes, the last time he took on the Los Angeles Chargers, Week 3 of the 2021 season, was able to put up 260 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 45 rushing yards for 22.9 fantasy points. There's been a lot of back and forth matchups between these two organizations, and they've been relatively higher scoring, and that kind of gives me more and more confidence in the potential that Patrick Mahomes can succeed. In fact, not only that, the Los Angeles Chargers, their defense has been in a little bit of a kind of muddy waters as of late. Specifically, in the last 5 consecutive games, they have given up 2 or more touchdowns to every single opposing quarterback. That, in my opinion, just continues to build confidence in the idea that Patrick Mahomes will not only find success today, but potentially meet his overall upside. Moving on to Taysom Hill, our number 7. Again, Taysom Hill is weekly by weekly kind of crept into this conversation. When we first initially ranked him, I think he was at like 15, 14, went to 10 last week. Now is in the top 7, considering his overall contributions via the running game. Last week, 73 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. When you're able to get 7.3 fantasy points from rushing yards alone, then 12 fantasy points from rushing touchdowns alone. It doesn't matter what you're doing in the passing game. Everything in the passing game is just gravy at that point, as long as he's not turning over the ball. Most recently against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, rushing quarterbacks have found themselves a lot of success, specifically Josh Allen, who was able to go for over 100 rushing yards and a touchdown. Jalen Hurts earlier this season on Thursday Night Football went for 25 total fantasy points against that secondary, in which he had 44 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. If this team cannot contain the quarterback position, specifically in Taysom Hill, then they'll have some trouble. And for many of us, we'll find a lot of fantasy upside. The thing that I wanted to mention before we get too excited about Taysom is that last week, he had a 40-yard rushing touchdown with 1 minute left on the clock. If he was a pure starting quarterback and knew the situation of the game, he would have needed the ball out at the 2-yard line. But fortunately for many of us, he gave us a 10-plus point fantasy influx in comparison to where he originally was. So be careful. But either way, I'm firing him up. I think he's a great play. Moving on. We have Jalen Hurts, another one of these mobile quarterbacks. This season alone, Jalen Hurts is averaging 21 fantasy points per game plus. The fact that he's been able to do what he has in terms of averaging about 58 rushing yards per game, has been able to score an unbelievable amount of rushing touchdowns this season. If he's able to at least score a touchdown, you know for a fact you're getting a 12-point base. Anything he does in the passing game against Washington will continue to be, overall upside. And to be honest, Washington, in terms of stopping the pass, has been their biggest weakness all season long based on the injuries that they face. Either way, I think Jalen Hurts, a fantastic play in this upcoming week's matchup, if he is able to potentially play with that high ankle sprain. Moving on to our number 9, we have, of course, Matthew Stafford. Matthew Stafford, 3 consecutive games of 3 passing touchdowns. Is he going to once again be capable of accomplishing that number without OBJ, without Darrell Henderson, with the potential of other players missing from this Los Angeles Rams lineup? I think it may be difficult to do so. Specifically, of course, they're taking on the Seattle Seahawks. Earlier this season, when he took them on, only was able to complete 1 passing touchdown. Was a little bit of a struggling matchup. But this week, they will be at home, and hopefully there will be a scenario in which Matthew Stafford can once again meet his upside. He's been playing incredibly as of late, so as long as he continues to stay pace regardless of what surrounds him, we'll be in a pretty good position. Moving on to Dak Prescott. Speaking of someone who's been quite inconsistent, Dak Prescott, 200 yards last week through the air, 1 passing touchdown, only 11.94 fantasy points. Pretty underwhelming against the Washington football team, which purely should have been a great matchup considering they were up very early, but they kind of took, the foot off the pedal and they just let Washington come back into that game. Either way, he gets to play against the New York Giants this week. Earlier this season, went for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns against that team in a very emotional game. Of course, the year prior had gotten himself hurt at home against the New York Giants. They once again played them, but either way, I think in this week's matchup could very easily post very high numbers. It's just a matter of what Dak Prescott is going to show up on Sunday. Moving on to Joe Burrow. Again, the fact that Joe Burrow finally got back to his 300-yard games with 2 passing touchdowns, Joe Mixon has kind of disappeared in terms of stealing and vulturing touchdowns. Certainly does help Joe Burrow fantasy managers, but are we going to see that once again this week against Denver? I think very easily it may be the case. It's going to be hard to run the ball in Denver. And if Denver can mount a lead in any sort of capacity, of course, Joe Burrow is going to have to, lead his team in another comeback attempt like he did last week against the San Francisco 49ers. I think he'll be perfectly fine regardless of how the game kind of pans out. He's just far too talented, has way too many pieces surrounding him. Moving on to Russell Wilson. Again, Russell Wilson, 3 consecutive weeks of 2 touchdowns. I think he's officially back, regardless of the fact that he takes on the Los Angeles Rams, and he has personally struggled against that defense in his career. I think Russell Wilson could very easily post, middle of the pack quarterback numbers, and that's why he sits at the number 12 position. Moving on to Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins takes on the Chicago Bears, giving up the 3rd most points to opposing quarterbacks. This is what I was talking about earlier in terms of finding players that can be more consistent in the fantasy playoffs that we can trust in. Kirk Cousins has had 6 consecutive weeks of 2 touchdowns. As long as he continues to do that, regardless of what he is doing, that in itself continues to prove to me that he is a viable option in my lineup. Moving on to Jimmy Garoppolo, another consistent quarterback. In 6 out of the last 7 games he has played, he has posted 2 or more touchdowns. Coming off of a 20-point fantasy week, 296 passing yards. As long as George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk surround him, Elijah Mitchell's returning, this offense is going to be highly potent against a relatively bad defense in the Atlanta Falcons, giving up the 6th most points to opposing quarterbacks. Tua Tagovailoa playing against the 4th easiest matchup, the New York Jets. Of course, a couple weeks back took them on, but since week 11 through 13, Tua has been the number 8 overall quarterback in fantasy, averaging 16.53 fantasy points. If he posts similar numbers, 16.53, then by all means, that's kind of what we expected. 200 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, that typically is probably going to be the case. Without Jalen Waddle there, without much of a running game, it may be a little bit difficult, but hopefully he'll be airing it out, as well as he has between weeks 11 through 13, in which he's had a 80+% passing completion percentage. Moving on to our final option, it is Justin Fields. Justin Fields takes on the Minnesota Vikings. They are the 2nd easiest matchup. Big Ben Roethlisberger and Jared Goff both threw for 3 total touchdowns against that Minnesota defense, whether they were healthy or, with their complete starters, Anthony Barr, Eric Kendricks, Patrick Peterson, all returning, it didn't matter. And the fact that we have a scenario in which Justin Fields takes them on, has the rushing upside. Last week against the Green Bay Packers, 74 rushing yards. Whenever you're able to accompany that performance, regardless of what you do in the passing game, with an incredible amount of yards, then by all means, you're a viable overall option. Those are our Week 15 tight end and quarterback rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Tomorrow, of course, we'll have our Hidden Gems segment. Saturday, we'll live stream. Sunday, we'll live stream and get you guys ready to get to Week 16 in advance, another week for the fantasy football playoffs. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Be sure to click the like button down below. Subscribe if you haven't yet already. Check out Underdog Fantasy. There's a lot of contests to be playing, of course, later tonight. The Los Angeles Chargers take on the Kansas City Chiefs. Should be a lot of fun there. I got to go draft myself some teams there, as I typically do. I'll give you guys some updates regarding that tomorrow. Outside of that, thank you for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.